Hi, and thank you for joining us. My name is Barak Brudo. I'm the developer advocate for Scribe Security, and I'm very, very happy to have with me today Dr. Chase Cunningham. Dr. Chase is the VP of Security Market Research at G2 and the host of the Dr. Zero Trust podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Gladly. Like a lot of our other webinars, obviously we're going to be talking about software supply chain security. And one of the first things that is important to lay out when we're starting to talk about this topic is how do you define the software supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, the software supply chain really is very much like any other supply chain. I think of it mainly along the lines of manufacturing, where you just want to know where things came from. You want to know how they're being built. You want to know the quality of the products that are within that piece of software. And then you want to know where it went. I think that a lot of times there's so much miscommunication in that supply chain for software because we have so many moving parts. You know, it's not, it's great that we can build software as fast as we can and as dynamically as we can, because that's what's keeping this economy afloat. But the fact that it is so dynamic and so transitory and so ethereal makes it difficult to manage. And on top of that, you have the issue of, well, software is kind of a living, breathing thing. When it gets out to wherever it's going to go, it's not like a truck or a motorcycle or something like that where it's static. You know, the software kind of evolves, and it will have additional risks built in, and new technologies will come along. So I think that this is probably one of the most difficult problems to solve in cyber. And then lastly, you know, we've got the back and forth where as a security person, I don't want to develop software, and most developers don't want to be security people, but we're in this together whether we like it or not. So we have to find ways to work together.
Very true. At least for me, and obviously for Scribe, assuming that one of the biggest threats is the unknown vulnerabilities hidden in open source or transient dependencies, how would you suggest dealing with this particular issue?
Yeah, so I was doing some research because when you invited me for this webinar, just to kind of back it up, and some numbers that I found were 1 in 8 open source software downloads have got known risks, something identified risks. 245,000 malicious packages were discovered just this year on GitHub. 18.6% of open source projects across Java, JavaScript were maintained in 2022 that are no longer maintained now, which there's a lot of JavaScript stuff going out there. 96% of vulnerable downloaded releases have a fixed or patched version of available, which is kind of good, but also kind of bad. And then if you look at the adoption of AI, there's been a 135% increase in machine learning created software components in the last 12 months. So the numbers aren't exactly what you would call good for secure software, but open source is really where we're building software off of. So there's got to be an approach to making sure that you're bringing in secure-ish components, because nothing is built secure. I mean, we build it as best we can, and then the very nature of any software is someone's going to go find a way to break it, because that's just what happens. And especially when open source is, there's no management of that going on. I can sit here this afternoon and have an idea and go write a piece of code, and it's a block someone else can use to build into another software product. And it is a very difficult problem to control. You know, the only thing you really can do is to be cautious about where you bring it down from, how you're going to put it into a product, and then test, and retest. Luckily, virtual systems make this doable. If we were doing this 5 years ago, I don't think we'd be able to keep it up and running, because you'd be running it on everyone's local machine. It would be a bad day for the internet at large.
That makes sense. Definitely the scope of the problem seems to be growing rather than diminishing. There's only more and more open source, and everything is always being built on top of everything else. So just like a couple of years ago with Log4j, we just saw how wide of a blast radius there could be for some small, slightly not well-maintained piece of open source. And Log4j was not that bad. There are some pieces of code that are way worse in terms of being maintained. But now, how effective, because we talked so much about knowing where things come from, where they're going, tracking everything, how effective would you consider the continuous production of an SBOM for the purpose of following what goes into production, and how would you rate that in terms of transparency and security?
I think most organizations, if they really looked at it, they would probably rate that on a scale of 1 to 10 as like a 2 at best. And it's just because, our sprints are 2 weeks, our, rollout cycles, everything is agile. We move software as quick as possible. And when you really get into it and go ask organizations that are building software or using it from that perspective, it's not well documented. It's not well tracked. Usually you can find a lot of information. You usually find more information in the README than you do in the actual procurement process for software as it's moving through that SBOM. So it's a known problem, and it is in introducing risk is the real issue. Is where are we at with this software? How is it coming in? What new things have been developed? Where did we get all these code pieces? Because no one writes software from line 0 anymore. We don't sit down and say this is a product and a project and we start writing, first line if then, and then we do the rest of it follow on. It's, well, what APIs would connect in here? Okay, well, what GitHub repos have got this stuff in? Oh, this one dude I knew 6 months ago wrote a really cool piece of code. Let me go see if I can email him and he'll send me the stuff. And it just becomes part of that monster. And none of that is typically well tracked with actual veracity along that SBOM. So most organizations need to be much better about how they do that. And you can't do it on a spreadsheet, and you can't do it on a piece of Word doc. It's got to be done with some software, because the scale is what gets you here. The speed and scale is what gets you.
So just to make sure I understood, you said that a lot of companies currently would rate it as a 2. Well, based on your explanation, it sounds like they need to rate it much higher. They need to be continuously creating SBOMs to have that information. Because if they
they should rate it as a 2 as far as how good they are at it, not how.
Oh,
yeah, so,
okay.
Yeah, they're not good at it. Yeah, it's a 15 on a 1 to 10 for importance. It's a 2 on effectiveness. Yeah.
Okay, it's an important distinction. I just wanted to make it.
Yeah.
Clear
No,
to
you're
our
right.
listeners.
Sorry, I messed that one up there. Yeah.
Well, that's why we're talking, so we can follow off each other. A lot of people would say when we present the case for SBOMs, why would I need an SBOM? I have an SCA scan running every time that I'm building my software. It's pretty much the same thing. I'm scanning my software. I find everything that I need to find, all the known vulnerabilities. Why do I need an SBOM?
Well, you're getting into a spot where there's a lot of legislation and requirements being drafted. The EU's got their stuff. The US has got things. There's things going on in APAC as well, where if you've written a piece of software and it's used as part of a major exploit or something goes wrong, hacks or whatever, you may wind up having to defend that particular application or piece of software in court. How would you do that and not have the liability on your organization if you don't have that credibility and trackability and veracity of what occurred? I mean, can you imagine if, I don't know, Ford Motor Company just said, we let everybody kind of build trucks and they send us all this stuff and we cobbled them together. And when trucks start falling off and, wheels come off going down the highway, we just go, oops, it wouldn't work. Right. I mean, it's the same thing with aircraft. How safe would we be in aircraft if we just had, you went down to Ricky's engine shop and this guy's wing thing, and you built this bird and then you said, let's fly it, and it falls out of the sky. Someone's going to be liable for that. That's not the way we do safe manufacturing of those very critical things. It's the same thing in software. So it's going to be something that a business that does app dev or does software development is going to have to deal with. And from being an expert witness in court, you don't want to be answering those questions without documentation to back it up.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because a lot of the relatively newer regulations coming out of the US speak a lot about being able to prove that you are secure, but they're very light on specifics. I didn't know you were an expert witnessed, but it makes sense. What kind of proof, apart from SBOMs and test results and other things along those lines, would you suggest a company would be accumulating, collecting, guarding?
Yeah, well, the big thing is to have a clear line of what's been done so that you can have trackability and traceability of that and be able to prove that you've done everything possible to be as secure as possible, not just kind of, well, we did our ISO 27001, which is, self-cert, and we did SOC 2, which is self-cert, and here it is, and then that's it. So being able to stand up in court and defend yourself, that you had the right controls in place, that you've had it verified and validated by other parties, that you've documented things as they progressed from 0 to 1, all the way up to delivery. If you can think about it much more along the lines of a physical product and how you would defend that in a court setting instead of just this virtual thing that is software. It needs to be thought of in that manner, and that's where you want to be. Luckily, the bar for knowledge in most court systems is really low, so it's not hard to step over it, but I wouldn't take it into account that they'll know what you're talking about. You've got to be able to describe it and document it and, roll it all out.
Makes sense. So definitely document exhaustively and make sure you know what you're talking about, even if the court doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, prove it beyond the standard of a reasonable doubt can be very difficult, especially when the folks that are, the ones that will evaluate that don't understand this space that well. Most judges, most courts, and I think this is pretty fair across international boundaries, they're not cybersecurity or software development experts. So don't think that they are. I always tell my customers and clients that I work with, if you can't describe it to a 5-year-old with a crayon, you need better documentation.
I would keep that in mind when working on our documentation. Considering the fast pace that software changes, and you already mentioned it, sprints of 2 weeks, everything is agile, you're constantly under pressure to push out new features and sometimes overhaul your entire product based on the feedback that you're getting, including both open source and the changes that you make to everything that you're doing that might bring in new vulnerabilities. How would you suggest approaching the problem of keeping everything updated and being aware of new issues coming up? Because let's assume that you're working on a new feature. You say, okay, everything else up to now, it's done, it's finished, I'm not touching it. I'm concentrating in this sprint on this new feature, and then next sprint you're concentrating on the next new feature. How do you keep everything in line so that a vulnerability that suddenly creeps up on something you worked on 6 months ago doesn't end up tripping you up?
Well, I mean, I think one is to just be real with the people that are in the leadership chain and say, look, we're never going to be 1,000% on this. Things will happen, but we're dealing with it as expeditiously as we can. I also would suggest that it's very worth it for organizations to engage in a real actual bug bounty program, because you'll find people that will test your software for you for, kind of free, that will come back and tell you, look, here's the thing we found. You pay them and then you go on about your way. And I can tell you from personal experience at a company I was at, we had someone literally DM me on Twitter and say that they'd found a vulnerability in our software. We made sure that that was legit. We tested it out, fixed the problem, and sent them a bug bounty, and everybody was happy. We never would have caught that if that hadn't occurred. So there's a lot of value in doing that. And then follow on, like, make this part of a process. You're not going to be able to keep up with development, right? That's every couple of weeks. But say every quarter, or maybe even once every 6 months, we're going to run and make sure that we do real test and update and check for vulns and patch and push and whatever. Make that a standardized process so that you keep up with it. And last side of that too is, it's also worth noting that typically, now there's some things that have happened that are slightly different, but typically you don't have a vulnerability that the next morning is an exploit that takes over the planet, right? It is, we've got some weird stuff happening. There's some vulnerabilities identified, blah, blah, blah. And you have a delta of time to fix the problem. So there is the ability to fix those issues. And then, the rack and stack of is it something that is weaponized, or is it just some problem in a piece of software? If it's a weaponized exploit within your software, you better move on it pretty quick. If it's just, hey, it, doesn't render right when the user reloads the page, we'll get to that when we have time.
Well, you're probably never going to have time. I know the fast pace of how these things work. Because you mentioned various tests that you would like to, at least in theory, run twice a year, every quarter. I'm imagining you're talking about something more serious than a standard scan or secret scan or stuff like that. You're probably talking about a red team or a pen tester going at it full bore and really trying to find issues with it. But other than having either a bug bounty program or a full-blown red team, what other tools or tests would you suggest to include in your software development lifecycle that might improve your software supply chain security? Notice I'm talking specifically about software supply chain security. I know there's lots of other tests that are available and should be done, but obviously this webinar is specifically on this topic.
Yeah, I would say there's a whole, like you said, that's the good thing about software supply chain and software in general is there's a million ways to solve this problem, but making it where you've got it as part of the process with the documentation and everything to follow is where the real value hits the road. I think personally a great thing is being able to, along the path of development, running this stuff through testing every chance you get in a virtualized system so that what weird stuff might occur and being able to deal with that as it rolls out. And you're probably doing that, but you've also got to throw in a lot of the other stuff that is prescriptive as far as like OWASP top 10 and whatever else to move that along the process. And every time you do it and you fix a problem, all that stuff needs to be documented, credibly so that it moves to the next phase. If we dev software by cobbling it together, we should test it by that same methodology as we progress instead of cobble, test. That just doesn't really work too well.
Okay, fair enough. It sounds very doable when you describe it like that, but obviously a lot of people who are listening and are actual developers and know the hectic pace in which they work, they'll say, we don't have the time. Our bosses don't give us the time. We don't have the tools, or everything is so coupled up to begin with when it comes to our pipelines that trying to put a full stop and pay our technical debts to make everything work properly is just not something that we're able to do until really catastrophic happens, and then you don't really have a choice and you do it anyway. So both you and a lot of other experts definitely don't wait for the piper to call. Do it now, and you'll be happy you'll be happy that you did later.
I mean, where's the smarter investment, to do it before it gets bad or to do it after you're dealing with the fallout? It would have been smarter for the folks that built the Titanic to test it out and see what would have happened if they flooded 4 compartments instead of thinking that it was good to go until it hit an iceberg and flooded 4 compartments.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Considering that the U.S. is probably on the forefront of best practices and regulations in terms of software supply chain security right now, are there any current suggestions? I know they're not always as clear as they should be, but are there any current suggestions that you would put your hands on and say, this is a good suggestion? It's not perfect, but it's a good first step, and you can take it and run with it.
I mean, I think NIST has done a really good job with the way that they're putting guidance and documentation out on, the way that it makes sense. I think it's 800-218 is where they're kind of pushing forward. And NIST, for those of us that are U.S. or that are around U.S., is kind of seen as a real wind vane in cyber and in security. So if you go look through the NIST 218, and it's got, it talks about the SDLC, it talks about those best practices and whatever else. If you can align to that and make that as part of your kind of full-on guiding approach, I think you're doing a lot of things correctly. And the other part is, you can't do what's being asked of by those organizations on a spreadsheet and a Word doc. Like, you're going to need technology from a vendor to do this stuff at speed and scale. Otherwise, you just wind up in the misery of trying to keep up with it. You could have a whole job just documenting software dev and security testing and whatever else, and you'll still never keep up. So I would say the other thing is align on one of those. NIST is a really good one, but then start figuring out how to use vendor solutions to do this at the speed and scale of development. In today's world, I don't really think it's justifiable for most businesses or developers to say we can't do this because it's too hard. I mean, that's what software is for. I don't know how to do my taxes. I use QuickBooks.
Okay. I'm not going to ask you to recommend any vendors, because obviously each of these solutions is completely different, like each of the requirements are different. I do want to point out that NIST 218 is nominally called as the SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework. It's recently been updated, and I highly recommend all our listeners to at least give it a slight read. It contains a lot of things, a lot of different suggestions, but it doesn't give you like do this, do that. It gives you suggestions, and you are in control of whatever steps you think fit your business model and your threats. So
that's a really good point too. A lot of people get sideways on the vendors kind of trying to tell them what to do or whatever else. You're the buyer in this particular scenario, and you're going to buy the solution from a vendor. It's your strategy. It's your approach to the problem. It's your software. You tell the vendor, this is how we're going to do it, and I would appreciate your help and input in your software, but I'm going to be the one using your stuff, so help me do that, not the other way around. You're not beholden to the vendor to drive your strategy.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good point. And like I said earlier, there's lots of vendors, lots of different solutions. If what you're looking for is not in the arsenal of this vendor, find another one. If no vendor has what you want, be forward thinking and build it yourself like you were looking for it. There's probably other people who are looking for it as well.
Yeah, there's according to our research at G2, there's about 4,000 vendors in cyber, so you should probably be able to find one that can help you.
More than I thought, but I'm only looking at the very limited field of software supply chain security. So I imagine that the entire field is much bigger than just that. One of the things that you haven't mentioned yet, and I'm kind of burning with curiosity, your moniker, Dr. Zero Trust, also the name of your podcast. Some people consider this idea or strategy of zero trust to be a good idea when it comes to software supply chain security, because obviously if you go into a system and you have the wrong credentials or credentials that you're not allowed to have, there's just a problem waiting to happen. So first, how do you apply zero trust to software supply chain security? And secondly, how did you get that moniker?
So yeah, so I'll flip it. The way I got the moniker was actually, I wish I could claim that it was something smart or intelligent that I did, but it actually came out of a joke between myself and some friends that I was doing so much work and documentation and consulting on zero trust. I said I should have had my PhD in that instead of computer science. So it just jokingly turned into Dr. Zero Trust, and here I am a few years later. But for the ZT side of software and app development, if you really look at the principles of what we talk about in zero trust, the basic concept is don't allow trusted relationships by default. And in software and app development, you can do that. A lot of times where you see things go wrong is people will hard code credentials. They'll do default trust relationships with software blocks. They'll tie into trusted parts of networks with applications or APIs or whatever else. Don't trust that those are safe. Don't trust that those are the smart way to do it. And be very cautious and very systematic and strategic about how you build your software. And you're reducing the risk and threat vectors. And that's what you're trying to get to. And then the other thing that we tell people in ZT world is there is no perfection, but you have to accept these liabilities and risks, do it smarter, and remove the fundamental requirements that the potential bad guy has, and you're doing better. So that I think is super valuable for people to understand.
Well, like zero trust, which is a framework, an idea that can be applied to many different things, another one that is, I think, not as well known to most people is the in toto framework, which is basically, in case you don't know it, I'll highly recommend you go and read the paper. Essentially, the idea is that every step that you take, doesn't matter in what, but for our demonstration, it will be in software development, every step has to be followed by another step. Every step is signed, and the chain of steps that follow one after the other is fully documented, and each step is signed and verified in turn, making the entire process very, very both traceable and very secure, because if anything bad happens, obviously the signatures won't match. Do you think that the in toto framework is valid as a strategy or a concept when it comes to software supply chain security?
Admittedly, I'm not intimately familiar with that because I spend my time researching the market broadly, but it certainly sounds like, from the concept of the right way to do it, it makes a lot of sense to me. So that also aligns with zero trust principles and concepts. So from my general understanding, I think that is a valid approach to the problem.
Great. We talked about various things. I would like to try and give our viewers and listeners some sort of coherent approach. So I know you probably don't have such a list. Nobody ever does. But if you were put on the spot, like, let's say, by an interviewer, such as me, and asked to give...
right now.
Yeah, and asked to give a certain list of steps or approaches to help protect yourself, your software, from software supply chain attacks, what kind of things would you include? And again, I'm not looking for specifics, no specific vendors or tools or tests. I'm just talking about approaches so that once you have the idea, this is what I'm supposed to look for, this is what I'm supposed to defend against, you're better off no matter what framework or language or product you're working on.
Yeah, I think in general, to me, it makes sense, obviously, to use virtual and cloud systems so that you can let your developed software kind of build there and be central so that you have better management control. I'm not a fan of letting people build things on their machine and then push and whatever else. I think it should be central control, central repository type deal. I also think that it's really valuable to have a very, very solid inventory of not only the software components and pieces, but also the people and developers that are doing things and building it, making sure that is managed, maintained, and controlled. And then on top of that, having a system or capability to cryptographically hash what is going on, how it's being done, where it's going, the process, the protocols, all those pieces, so that you are documenting as the development pushes to that next stage. And then finally, test, and testing as much as you can along the way without impacting development. But before you finally push that piece of software out, run it as much as you possibly can in a realistic scenario and see what the issues might be that you're going to face. Too often we move super quick and we get it to where it's useful and we put it in the hands of folks, and then it becomes something that probably makes money and no one wants to kill the golden goose. So before you let the goose out of the barn, if that's a thing, make sure that you do it smarter as you get to that last step.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure our listeners are grateful as well. I went through my questions relatively quickly, but it definitely sounds like you know what you're about. So at this point, if we don't have any questions from our viewers, which I don't think we do, I would say thank you very much for joining us. If there are questions, I say put them, send them to me or to Scribe, or when we put out the video, put it there, and I'll do my best to answer any and all questions put to us, if I can. If I don't, I'll forward them to Dr. Chase. Thank you again for joining me today and for having all this wonderful knowledge and tips for people about software supply chain security. And I hope for quiet and secure days, both in software and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.